Hi everybody, welcome. Today I will be talking about Angular and technical SEO, whether it will be a fantastic talk, like Johannes mentioned, that we will see afterwards, because this is a brand new talk. Well, who am I? I'm a freelance software engineer. I'm also the organizer of the Belgian Angular Conference NGBE and the Angular Belgium Meetup Group, and I'm a GDE for Angular. If you want to learn more about me, please visit my website. So, for today, let me start with a short story. Imagine you were coding and you were coding like a ninja and you've been working together with an awesome team on a big project for a very long time. And finally, the end is near and a big release is coming. But suddenly a wild SEO expert working on your project appears. Well, it should have appeared much earlier, somewhere in the early phases of the project, but that's not on our plate for today, project management. Well, but just imagine that SEO expert tells you that the application is super nice, works really well, so you did a good job, but it cannot be shared on social media. Sharing a route of your application is not pre-rendering on social media. And it seems that the indexing capabilities on Google are not working as well. So that's quite a big bummer. So the big question for today is, how can we as Angular developers help SEO experts to reach their goals? Let's find the answers to this question. There are plenty of things that can boost or break down the search engine optimization goals of your website or application. For today, let's focus on 5 things that we as Angular developers and architects can do to help reach the goals of the SEO experts working on our projects. The first one, and the most low-level and basic thing to do that we can do as developers, is to write proper semantic HTML and adhere to a low text code ratio. What that all means, we will tackle that later, but for now, let's focus on the 5 things that we can do. The next thing is that we can provide functionality to dynamically update the title, the meta tags, and other relevant and important tags in our application. We can implement features that enable rich search results by using RDFA, microdata, or JSON-LD. And we can enable perfect crawling accessibility, which is a very crucial part for search engine optimization. And in general, we should always provide a great user experience to our users. But first, a remark up front. All these concepts will be explained on a very high level, and they are intended to give you a head start when you are researching for yourself. So if you have a specific question and perhaps a detailed question about any of the topics, please feel free to post them in the chat. I will be happy to answer them after the talk if I can. So the first concept, semantic HTML. Semantic HTML is very important because proper usage of HTML code gives meaning to the content that it surrounds or embraces. For example, when we use H1, H2, up till H6, our browser knows that this is a title, but also search engines and other crawlers or screen readers will know how to handle this piece of information. The same is true for other elements like lists or images or forms or figures that have a caption. The question to always ask yourself when coding HTML is, what elements best describe or represent the data that I'm going to populate in my HTML code? And if you're not sure about that, you can always ask your favorite SEO expert. He should be able to help you out and provide instructions, but because we cannot be expert in everything that we do. So it's okay to ask for other people their opinion, and especially an SEO expert on this matter. Semantics can not only be applied on HTML, but it can also be applied on other code like JavaScript or CSS. This part is not so very important for SEO, but I still want to mention it. For example, in CSS, consider styling a list with list items representing different types of fruit. Would you know what part of the DOM is being selected with div ul li? Or would it be easier for you if you used a class that's called fruits __ item? For me, it would be much easier to use the BAM approach with fruits item. Next to that, in JavaScript, consider a function that takes a string parameter and returns a list item element with that string as its text content. Would you need to look at the code to understand what the function did if it was called build with peach or create list item with content? Think about it. It's all about being descriptive and giving meaning to your code. And you don't have to worry about giving long names to your variables or function names because that code will get minified anyway. So for more details on semantics on the web, I happily refer you to this great resource on the Mozilla Developer Network, where you can learn much more about it. So normally, all text content on your page should and can be embraced by the appropriate HTML tag with that has a semantic value. This will guard us from the overuse of, for example, divs and spans. And this kind of disease, like we say, like divitis and spanitis, have been described on the internet for many years. And it's very common and very widespread all over the internet. You might find other information on the internet with other terms like divitis or spanitis. They're all the same, they're just different terms for it. But in general, if you find many divs wrapped in another, but without a very clear reason, you could probably think about refactoring it. There's almost always a logical refactor possible. But perhaps you're doing fancy position tricks or having special markup that might require a lot of divs. That's possible, but as always, you should assess your case very carefully. So when we use the proper semantic HTML, our text-to-code ratio will drop, meaning that we will need less bytes of HTML tags compared to the amount of bytes that represent the actual text content. And this ratio indicates search engines that the page contains a decent amount of text that should be indexed. So if we compare the two options from our previous example, we can clearly see that the amount of HTML tags is much less if we use the proper semantic HTML tags. And again, if you're unsure about how to achieve a good text-to-code ratio for your specific case, get in touch with your favorite SEO expert. Another thing, a very basic example, but a typical code snippet that I see coming out from code reviews is this one. And it's because we can't use more than one structural directive on an element. The ngIf gets applied on a div surrounding the element that has the ng4 applied on it, in this case, the article. This will add a surrounding div if the feature is enabled. So if the ngIf condition evaluates to true. But by using, for example, ng container, we can avoid adding extra code to the HTML output only to enable our, that we would add only to enable our Angular-driven dynamic content. And the ng container, it will not result in any extra HTML code. So using this approach, you will get a lower text-to-code ratio. The next thing, setting titles and meta tags and other tags are very important for SEO. And it's also very important for the sharing capability of your application on social networks. In most cases, the actual title of your page will be used in the search results of search engines, but also in the preview of the routes that you share on social media. So your application should always be able to set a unique title for each page. That's what we do here in the code snippet, as you can see in the public set title method. And many, if not all, social media platforms, like I already said, allow you to share content on your feed. If you want the platform to generate a preview of that route that you're sharing, the page needs to implement the correct meta tags for those specific platforms. So what you see here is the required code to make everything work properly for the title on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. The title and meta service provided by Angular are very easy to use helper services that will enable this for you. And what you should take away from this is that each platform uses different implementations and rules. For example, setting the title of your page could look like this. And you have to keep in mind that different platforms well, like I already said, they use different different naming for their properties and their values. So Twitter, for example, requires a meta tag with a name attribute and a specific Twitter prefix value. But Facebook is following Open Graph Protocol, and it requires the property attribute name with the OG prefix value. Some other platforms, like for example LinkedIn, they are also following the Open Graph Protocol, but each social media network could implement its own requirement. So it's very important that you always check your own need, because this is only tested. This code is only tested for Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. There are other important tags that could be implemented in the page for SEO purposes. And for example, the canonical link. The canonical link denotes a single source of truth of this content. And for example, also you could link potential alternative pages, for example, alternative languages of the shown content. And those are, so the canonical link and the alternative links are two of the most significant examples. Setting these specific elements in head can be achieved simply by using the document service that wraps around the document global object, and it exposes its API. And as always, your project will have its own specific needs, so please check with your SEO expert. The title and meta service plus the document should be enough to implement all these specific technical requirements. There are several community plugins available for this that will do the job for you if you implement them correctly. So you can just search for Angular SEO on NPM and you will find plenty of relevant packages. You will also find NGX SEO, which is a library that I made, but in many cases you will probably want to build your own library, because your logic will depend on the needs of your specific project. So please be inspired by the source code of NGX SEO, which is public. You can use that to set up your own version of the implementation. Then, rich search results, which is very interesting. And you might have already seen this kind of search results in Google search. It's very hard to miss them. And these snippets of extra relevant data to your search results, they are provided by a structured data that is added on top of the normal text content that gets extracted from your pages. So for the first result, we get a related list of frequently asked questions. And we can open up each question to see the answer. And on the second result, we get a rating score and a price range of an hotel that was part of the search results. So how can we achieve this? There are three potential ways of doing this. So three potential ways of adding structured data. And the first one is RDFA, which is short for the Resource Description Framework in Attributes, a very long name, but it's an official W3C recommendation that can be used to set structured data using attributes on elements in any XML-based markup language, like for example, HTML. The second one is microdata. It's actually it's an alternative to RDFA. It's a little bit younger, but it's quite similar. The difference with RDFA is that it can only be used on HTML code. And the last, which is definitely not the least, is JSON-linked data. And JSON-linked data is the more modern, data-driven and recommended approach by Google. The structured data can be outputted as JSON compared to adding it to the attributes of each relevant HTML element, which will require you to do a lot more coding and implies a lot of maintenance work as well. So the thing to remember from this slide is that in the end, they all provide the same result, because they're all based on a specific scheme that gets defined in a library of schemes. Schema.org is one of those libraries, and as far as I know, it's the most widely adopted. I don't only do SEO projects, but this is the only one that I've used so far. And the library describes, for example, an entity named person, and it provides examples on how to build a markup or data structures that will enrich your code. In this case, let's take the example of George Bush, which is a former president, whom is a former president of the USA. And this is just taken because this example is shown on the website. And this is the description of who he was. We will implement this example description of a public person using RDFA, microdata, and JSON-LD. So to enable RDFA in your Angular templates, you only need to add the specific attributes to your HTML code. There's nothing more to it. And this is very easily done in your HTML of your Angular template, because it does not even imply something something dynamic. The data itself is dynamic, but there's no change for you. You just apply the property. Same is true for microdata, only the attributes are different. So again, to enable this in your Angular templates, you only need to add the specific attributes to your HTML code. This JSON-LD structure will probably be more appealing to you as a developer, because in fact it's very easy, and it's just serializing a JSON object into your HTML, and boom, you're done. The backend or CMS could be responsible for generating the structure, and you as a front-end developer just have to print it out in your Angular code. But how do we get this snippet outputted in our code? Is there a service for that, perhaps provided by Angular? I haven't found it, so I think it's not there yet, but it's not rocket science to code it ourselves. So let's take a look at a basic example on how to do this. I hope you can all read this code. I had to fit in the code on the slide, but I think it's readable. So basically, this service is all you need to get started with outputting JSON-LD in your pages. The service only requires you to have the object with the data available. And as I mentioned before, that can come from your backend or from your CMS. So it can already be structured as it should be. But of course, feel free to implement your own business logic in your application to do this. And this code is heavily based, and it's practically the same as the code for setting the canonical URL in the head of the page. We just first check if it's already there, if it's already a script tag there. If it's there, we replace the text content with the new data. And if it's not there yet, we create a new element and we add it to the head of the document. So the fourth important thing, and actually a very crucial thing for proper SEO and a shared capability on social media networks, is that you should enable crawl accessibility. So if you don't do anything fancy with your static server setup to serve your Angular application, with, for example, a robots.txt file, or you perhaps are blocking search engines from indexing your application using some server-side configured headers, if you don't do that, crawlers should normally see a result coming from your server that looks like the screenshot that you see on the left. But this is the auto-generated index.html file that should get served for every route of your Angular application, but it does not contain any content. And why is that? Because typically the browser is responsible for generating and building up the pages of JavaScript-heavy applications. Angular is the same. They are client-side rendered. And while some crawlers, like the new and updated evergreen Googlebot, are able to render the full pages to some extent, many others aren't, and they need a little help. And therefore, for them, we need to enable server-side rendering or pre-rendering. And there are currently two notable options for server-side and pre-rendering of Angular application. The first one is Angular Universal, and the second one is Scully. Universal will enable server-side rendering and pre-rendering. Universal is best used with highly changing, volatile, and dynamic content, and when your application has a lot of dynamic pages. And with a lot, I would say in the order of, let's say, 10,000 and more. But you can also use it, of course, with a low amount of pages. Angular Universal does require a lot of strict coding principles, but if you follow them, the result will be pretty fast. Scully, on the other hand, enables pre-rendering, but it's not fitted for server-side rendering. The upside of Scully is that it can be used with any Angular application using any third-party library. The related downside is that it can be slow while rendering the pages. And Scully is therefore best used for low volatile, so not often changing content, but still dynamic content with a limited amount of pages. And why is that? Because every time the content of all those pages change, you need to rebuild them and redeploy them to your static web server. So if you want to know more and read more about Scully or Universal, I've written quite a lot of articles on Scully, how it compares with Universal, and a lot of SEO related topics for Angular. I do a deep dive on the most important differences, which allows you to make your own educated choice. One more pro tip, one that I learned the hard way, is that when you do server-side rendering or pre-rendering, you might be tempted to minify the HTML output of the rendering. This is a good thing, and it will save your visitors even more bytes when they load your pages. So less bytes is better, which is in its turn is good for SEO. But you should be careful. You should not try to over-minify your output, because not all crawlers are as smart in understanding the output. The browser might understand it because it's very forgiving, but other clients, like a normal HTML parser, will require a strict and a full HTML tree to be able to parse all the content. So as you can see in this example with the LinkedIn post inspector, I checked my own homepage already a while ago while I was learning about all these minification things. And I realized that LinkedIn was not able to find the meta tags in the HTML output because there was a vital piece of code missing in the source code. And more specifically, the head tag was missing. And why is that? Because of the use of HTML minification options that include the setting to remove the attribute quotes and the optional tags. So the head tag is also an optional tag. So for a browser will be able to understand it and correct it for you, but a more basic parser like the one that LinkedIn uses will require you to keep the HTML and the head tag and any other optional tag in the HTML output. LinkedIn parser expects that the meta tags are directly placed in the head tag of the HTML output. So very simple. I had to do a lot of trial and error on this to get it right. But if we just disable the removal of the attribute codes and optional tags by the HTML minifier, everything works as expected. And LinkedIn is able to properly render a preview of the URL that you are sharing. So fortunately, we have a lot of tools. We have plenty of tools available to validate HTML output of our pages. And nearly every big player, including the social media networks, have some way to validate and perhaps burst the cache of the previews of the pages that you try to share on the feeds of those social networks. And while this overview links the most important validators, mostly for my projects like Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, and Google, you should always check your own need, because you might have an audience that is heavily relying on Bing, for example, or on Baidu, or even on Yahoo for people that are still using that. And also depending on your location in the world, it might also differ. So you always need to check the needs of your project. So if you get all those 4 things right, so semantic HTML, enabling the setting of title, meta tags, and other relevant tags, enabling rich data in your application, and doing server-side rendering or pre-rendering, you will have started with a very good recipe for a great user experience. But like with all recipes and every meal, we can still add extra spices and herbs to make it very perfect. So remember that these are just the basics. In general, you should remember that if your pages are fast, they are low on memory consumption, and they don't take a lot of bandwidth, especially on mobile, your users and search engines will be happy. Thank you very, very, very much for your attention, and feel free to contact me via email or directly on Twitter. I hope there are questions, because I will be very happy to answer some of them in the Q&A session in a few minutes.